Before electricity hummed behind every wall, before light came with the flick of a switch, darkness was not just the absence of light, it was fear, disease, and death hiding in every corner of your home. In the 1600s, even a single flame could mean life or a funeral pyre. How did they light their world? The answer is more disturbing than you might think. This is not a history of candles. It's a descent into the choking smoke, rotting animal fat, and desperate innovations that kept the darkness at bay, and sometimes invited worse things in. The darkness was alive. When the sun dipped behind the hills and the last ember of daylight vanished, homes were swallowed whole by the dark. Not the soft dark you know from power outages or rural skies, but a suffocating, absolute void. You couldn't see your hand, couldn't trust the floor beneath your feet. Shadows didn't exist because there was no light to cast them. It was not absence, it was presence. Inside the hut, the walls creaked like they breathed. The straw roof whispered under the weight of unseen things. The wooden boards beneath your feet popped in the cold, and something scurried, rat or something worse. Every sound was amplified by silence. Every silence was a question your mind tried to answer with fear. People in the pre-electric world didn't just fear darkness, they felt it. The moment dusk fell, the world shrank to whatever glowed faintly in the hearth. Beyond that, monsters, real and imagined. Wolves howled in the distance. Owls screeched in ways that sounded too human, and in some villages, the dark was still considered a spiritual force, a living, malevolent entity you did not name. This fear wasn't childish, it was earned. Without light, people went missing. Children wandered and were never found. Fires burned down homes when someone stumbled into an unattended flame. Women heard footsteps behind them and prayed it was a neighbor, not a predator. Darkness was the cover for crimes, for illness, for accidents that claimed lives without mercy. So families clung together at night, huddled in one room, breathing each other's fear. They whispered stories, some to comfort, most to warn, tales of shadow men, night spirits, and witches who only came after sundown. The line between folklore and fact blurred when the only light in the room came from the slow collapse of burning wood. In those hours, time twisted. Night could stretch forever. The mind, deprived of light, played cruel tricks. Shapes formed in rafters, moans echoed with no mouths, and death didn't feel far away. This was not a world awaiting progress. This was survival in the rawest sense, against cold, hunger, disease, and the night itself. Before they ever invented light, they learned to fear what lived without it. Tallow, fat, and the stench of light. Light didn't come clean. It came oozing from the flesh of the dead. Before paraffin, before kerosene, before the elegance of oil or gaslight, people lit their homes with fat, boiled, rendered, and reeking. Tallow was the poor man's answer to the night. Thick animal grease dripped into mold, hardened into pale, greasy candles that hissed and spat when burned. Every flicker came with the scent of slaughter. These were not romantic flames. A tallow candle filled the room with smoke, so thick it clung to the throat, coated the lungs. Curtains turned yellow. Ceilings blackened, children coughed through the night, eyes stinging from the fume, yet families lit them anyway, because what was the alternative? To sit in the crushing dark and hope nothing found you? The fat came from cows, pigs, even stray dogs or horses when times were desperate. Nothing was wasted, not because of efficiency, but because survival didn't ask for dignity. Housewives collected scraps from butchers or slaughterhouses, scraping hardened tallow from old bone, boiling the mess for hours until it became usable. The smell during rendering was legendary, nauseating, sour, thick enough to make neighbors gag through closed windows. But even the filthiest candle was precious. One flame and the shadows pulled back just enough to see your child's face, just enough to keep the nightmares behind the door. Still, the flame came with fear. Tallow candles were unstable. They sputtered and collapsed into pools of liquid fat that could ignite into chaos. They dripped like blood and sometimes sparked like dry twigs. Left unattended, they became household arsonists. But in winter, with nights stretching 15 hours, there was no choice but to risk it. Imagine sitting at a wooden table, the single tallow candle between you and a black void. The air smells of death. You can hear the candle cracking as a vein of air bubbles bursts inside the fat. And you hope that it doesn't fall over, doesn't sputter out, doesn't set your thatched roof ablaze. Some tried to mask the smell by adding herbs, lavender, thyme, but most simply endured. Even churches, which could afford better lighting, sometimes reeked of cheap tallow during winter services. The faithful sat in pews beneath a pall of smoke, praising a God they could barely see through the haze. Tallow was light, but it wasn't safety. It was smoke in your lungs, poison on your walls, and fire waiting to happen. Yet without it, there was only the dark and everything that came with it. The cost of a flame. To light a single candle wasn't just a decision, it was an act of economic courage. In medieval and early modern Europe, the price of even the lowest grade candle could be staggering. A single tallow candle might cost what a laborer earned in an entire day. That tiny stub of flickering grease didn't just illuminate a room. It represented hours of sweat, back pain, and frostbitten fingers in the field. For the poor, light was rationed more strictly than bread. Families didn't burn candles freely, they hoarded them. Some kept a single candle for emergencies, hidden like a treasure. It would only be lit if someone was dying, or about to give birth, or if something far worse was outside the door. For most households, once the sun vanished, so did activity. Tasks stopped. Reading was impossible. Even sewing or mending, a crucial chore, had to wait. Nights were for sleeping, praying, or simply waiting in silence. Some homes used the one-room light strategy. All members of the household crowded into a single space, shoulder to shoulder, around the dim flame of one candle or rushlight. There was no privacy, no separation, only the glow of shared scarcity. And even then, the light had to be watched constantly. A candle burned down was money lost. Many used primitive holders with pins and hooks to adjust the height and angle of a flame, stretching every inch of tallow. Others used mirrors or polished metal to reflect and magnify the little light they had. Desperate optics in a war against darkness. Children were taught early, don't waste the flame. A knocked-over candle was not just dangerous, it was shameful. a waste of food, warmth, and wealth. Punishments could be severe. The rich, of course, lived differently. They burned beeswax candles, clean, fragrant, and bright. Entire chandeliers lit their dining rooms, signaling power, sophistication, and the painful reminder to the poor that some could afford to burn light like air. But for most, light was not a birthright. It was a burden, a gamble, a risk weighed against hunger. How much do you need to see, really? Is it worth it? So they sat in darkness, not because they loved it, but because they couldn't afford anything else. Rushlights and rotten swamps. When candles were too costly and oil was a fantasy, the poor turned to the land, to the rot, to the filth, to the swamp. Enter the rushlight, a desperate invention of poverty, built not in workshops, but in the mud and muck of riverbanks. These makeshift torches were crafted from common rush plants, slender reeds with spongy cores, peeled, dried, and then soaked in rendered animal fat or drippings from old pans. They were called lights, but they barely earned the name. Their glow was pitiful, a flicker no stronger than a dying match. They hissed, smoked, and lasted maybe 10 minutes before burning out or collapsing in on themselves. Yet for millions, this was the only flame they could hope for. Harvesting rushes was no graceful task. It meant wading barefoot through slimy marshes, hands red with cold, swatting at biting insects while trying not to slip into the muck. It was women's work, children's work, labor done in silence and shame, and the product of all that filth, a brief reprieve from blindness. The rushlights themselves were grim. The stems would be dipped in any fact that could be found: old bacon grease, sheep drippings, even rancid kitchen waste. The smell that filled a room wasn't illumination, it was decay. And yet when lit, they gave just enough light to find the privy, sew a torn shirt, or swat a rat. Some clever households constructed holders, iron pincers or wooden notches that allowed rushlights to stand vertically or lean at angles to control the burn rate. They measured time in rushlight segments: 1 rush to boiled porridge, 3 rushes for a bedtime story, a crude, smoky clock ticking down the dark. The flame bent and curled, not steady like a candle, but wild. Shadows danced like spirits on the walls. It gave just enough visibility to remind people what they couldn't see. And still, people were proud. A well-made rushlight was a triumph, a moment of control over a world that gave them so little. There's something haunting in the idea that people scavenged the swamps just to bring home a few minutes of flickering, foul-smelling hope. In their hands, the marsh gave up its rot, and in that rot, a little light. Lanterns of bone and horn. When glass was a luxury, reserved for churches and castles, the poor turned to the bodies of animals, not just for food, but for light. If you couldn't afford a glazed window or an oil lamp with crystal panes, you made do with what was left after the slaughter: animal horn, translucent when scraped thin, and bone, carved and bent into grotesque shapes. These weren't lanterns in the romantic sense. They were stitched together masks of death, glowing faintly from the inside. Horn lanterns began with oxen or cattle. After the beast was butchered, its horn was boiled, softened, split, and scraped until it resembled cloudy parchment, thin enough to pass a flicker of candlelight, thick enough to muffle it into a ghostly haze. The result was eerie, light that wavered like breath on a mirror, bent through warped yellow plates that made shadows twist and faces deform. When lit, these lanterns didn't chase away darkness, they distorted it. Imagine holding one in a pitch-black cottage, the pale glow bouncing off a damp wall, your reflection curving like a corpse in water. The light didn't comfort, it unsettled. It was just enough to see someone's eyes, but not the expression behind them. Children feared them. Superstitions grew around the way the horn flickered, how it seemed to breathe. Some said spirits couldn't cross horn light. Others believed the souls of the animals were trapped inside, forever doomed to light the homes of the living. Bone lanterns were rarer, but even more grotesque. Used more in ritual or rural tradition, they combined carved slits of rib bone with grease-dipped cloth for wicks. The light that escaped was fragmented, like seeing through a cage. These were tools of desperation, or sometimes fear, used not just to see, but to ward off what couldn't be seen. The homes that used them were often the poorest. No windows, just slits in the walls stuffed with rags or straw. The lantern was hung by the hearth or near the door, casting warped light over tools, beds, and prayer figures. Even with the flame lit, the room felt haunted. This was how people lived, surrounded by the dead, lit by what they could harvest from carcass and bone. It wasn't just a light source, it was a reminder. Everything here came at a cost, even the light. The fire that watched you sleep. For most of human history, the hearth was more than a fireplace. It was the only god that never slept. In a world without switches or sensors, your fire was your life. It cooked your food, dried your clothes, warmed your children, lit your home. And it had to be kept alive, night after night, year after year. Letting the flame die was not just inconvenient, it was dangerous. In winter, it could mean death. So every family had a ritual. Before sleep, someone tended the fire. Ashes were mounded over the embers like a blanket, insulating the heat. If done right, it would smolder silently until morning. If done wrong, it would die. Or worse, ignite something nearby and consume the house. The hearth was usually in the center of the room. There was no chimney in early homes, just a hole in the roof where smoke could escape. Soot coated the rafters, and coughing children learned to sleep with their backs to the wind. Around the fire, people slept like clock hands, heads pointed inward, feet outward, because it wasn't just warmth they needed, it was sightline. If the fire flared, cracked, or faded, someone would know. But fire was not a friend. It hissed, it moaned, it moved. In the half-dark, the flames often seemed to take shape, long limbs curling, faces appearing in the smoke. Old people told stories of spirits in the coals, warning their children, never stare too long into the flames, or they'll stare back. Some swore the fire spoke. Others believed it remembered, that if you let it die too many nights in a row, it would take revenge, not with a blaze, but with cold, bitter silence that no spark could break. And the fire watched. It was the last thing you saw before you closed your eyes, and the first thing you checked when you woke. Even in sleep, your ears were tuned to its language. Pops, shifts, sighs. A loud crack in the night meant danger. A sudden dimming meant panic. People didn't sleep deeply. Not then. There was no off switch, no safety. Just glowing embers in a wooden hut, surrounded by dry straw and a roof of kindling. You slept beside the thing that could save you or destroy you. And every night you prayed it stayed hungry, but not too hungry. When the moon was a lamp, sometimes there was no candle, no rushlight, no glowing coals. And on those nights, the only thing that pierced the dark was the moon, cold, pale, and distant. For the poor, the moon wasn't just poetic, it was practical. It was the free lamp of the sky, and people planned their lives around it. Full moons were sacred windows of opportunity. If you needed to travel, deliver a baby, bury a body, or run from something or someone, you did it by moonlight. Calendars marked light nights, peasants scheduled harvests, thieves planned break-ins, and lovers risked secret meetings, all under the moon's borrowed glow. It was said that no evil could hide from the full moon, but that wasn't comfort. That was warning. If you could see them, they could see you. Homes without light opened their shutters to the sky. Pale beams poured in through cracks in the wall, falling in patches across the dirt floor. The moon gave just enough for a mother to rock her child, for an old man to find the piss pot, or for a murderer to see his victim's eyes. The moon's light was pure, but its presence was not. People feared what it awakened. Lunacy, the word comes from luna, the moon. They believed it could twist your mind, lure you into the woods, draw out the worst in men. Even sleepwalkers were seen as moon-touched, their souls wandering under its pull. Wolves howled louder during a full moon. Cattle grew restless. Births came faster, deaths too. Some believed the moon watched, like a giant lidless spy scanning the land for sins. It made shadows sharper, but also made you aware of just how far the dark stretched beyond it. Even indoors, people felt its presence. They whispered prayers when its light flooded the room too strongly. Superstition said that if moonlight touched a sleeping face for too long, it could steal the breath or invite a demon. So cradles were turned, blankets were pulled high, windows were covered with rags. It gave light, but never warmth. It revealed, but never explained. The moon illuminated just enough to keep people moving, and just enough to keep them afraid. And on nights when even the moon stayed hidden behind clouds, people didn't bother praying. They just stayed still and hoped the dark passed without learning their names. The dark wasn't empty. They feared the dark not because they were superstitious, but because they had reason to be. In pre-modern life, darkness wasn't just an absence of light. It was a presence all its own. It moved. It listened. It hid things that should not move, things that should not breathe. There were no streetlights, no glow from distant towns, no artificial hum. When the sun went down, the world closed its eyes, and anything could happen while it slept. Wolves crept close to villages, their eyes catching what little light flickered in cottage windows. Highwaymen waited in the blackness between towns, where horses refused to step. Rabid dogs, lost souls, starving men with knives, and something worse. The unknown, the things no one had ever named. Every creak was a signal. Every gust of wind could be a whisper. The shadows on the wall were never trusted. Even if you lit a candle, you couldn't see into the corners. You couldn't see what might be standing behind the door you forgot to bolt. Children were told stories to keep them cautious, warnings disguised as bedtime tales. The one about the pale figure who stood just outside the window after dark, or the woman who would creep in if you left the hearth untended. The dark was a test. You had to respect it, obey its rules, or you vanished into it. Doors were barred at night, shutters nailed shut, fires banked low. People spoke softly after sundown, as if loud voices might attract attention, not from neighbors, but from something listening just outside the light's reach. Some households hung iron charms, salt lines, or bits of bone near thresholds, not because they were foolish, but because they understood logic didn't matter in the dark. Fear was its own kind of truth. The wealthy had guards and lanterns. The poor had a single flame. Either way, when the dark fell, everyone felt it watching. And when a light went out unexpectedly, when a rushlight sputtered, or a candle collapsed in its own wax, people didn't just rush to relight it. They froze, because for that one breathless moment, the dark was everything. And if it wasn't empty, then what had just arrived? Lanterns of the living and the dead. In the dark, light was a fragile barrier, not just between shadow and sight, but between life and death. Lanterns didn't only illuminate homes, they guided souls. Across centuries, countless cultures believed that the living's light kept the restless dead at bay. In villages and hamlets, the glow of a lantern wasn't just practical. It was a ward against the unknown horrors lurking just beyond. At funerals, lanterns led the way, their trembling flames illuminating mourners' faces etched with grief and fear. They were carried not only to light the path, but to keep wandering spirits from joining the living in their sorrow. Some believed the dead followed the lantern's glow, trapped between worlds until the flame died. Inside homes, lanterns were hung near doorways and windows, thresholds between safety and danger. It was said the light chased away evil spirits, witches, and demons that prowled after dark. The faint glow acted as a shield, fragile but vital, a beacon of protection against things that hunger for human fear. But lanterns also carried stories darker than superstition, stories whispered around fires of how some lanterns burned too bright, attracting attention from things best left unseen, how a careless flame could beckon death closer, drawing eyes that lurked just beyond the veil. People lived in the tension of this balance. Too little light meant vulnerability. Too much light meant exposure. Every lantern held a secret pact between the living, desperate to survive, and the dead, desperate to return. And sometimes, on the coldest, darkest nights, villagers swore they saw lanterns floating in the mist, not carried by any living hand, ghostly glimmers that danced just out of reach, reminding the living that light and dark were entwined in a dance older than memory. In that ancient glow, the line between life and death blurred. The lantern was more than a tool. It was a sentinel. And in a world without modern lamps, it was the last hope that the dark might keep its distance. The dawn of modern light. After centuries of smoke, shadows, and flickering death traps, light finally began to change. The old ways, tallow candles, Rushlights, bone lanterns, had ruled the night for so long that people forgot what clean, steady light felt like, until the late 18th and early 19th centuries, when new inventions sparked a revolution that would pull humanity out of the dark. The invention of whale oil lamps offered a brighter, steadier flame. Though whale oil was expensive and limited, it burned cleaner and longer than tallow. It was a fragile promise of something better, a flame without the choking smoke, the rancid smell, the fire risk. Soon after came the kerosene lamp, a miracle of distillation that made light affordable for many. It burned clearer, smelled less, and could be carried safely. For the first time, people could push back the dark without fear of setting their homes ablaze. Gas lighting followed, flooding cities with unnatural daylight. Streets, once crawling with shadows and danger, were transformed into places of movement and life after dusk. The night lost its power to terrify. And then came the electric bulb, a tiny spark that ended an age of suffering. Light became a flick of a switch, clean and constant. Darkness was pushed back, trapped behind glass and wires. But with this new light came a price. The dark spaces where imagination, fear, and mystery once lived began to vanish. The stories whispered around flickering flames faded into memory. The shadows that danced on rough walls, those primal, terrifying shapes were gone. People forgot how fragile their ancestors' light was. They forgot the stench of tallow, the hiss of rushlights, the watchful fire that guarded their sleep. The modern lamp did more than brighten rooms. It rewrote humanity's relationship with night itself. Yet somewhere deep in the human soul, a flicker remains. A yearning for that raw, imperfect light, the kind that speaks of survival, of fear, of resilience, the kind that reminds us how dark the night once was and how precious every spark had to be.